The most dangerous man in Miami had never bowed to anyone, until a waitress crashed into his chest in a restaurant hallway, eyes full of fear, and whispered just one sentence: "Please, pretend you know me." That night, he saved a woman he had never spoken to, but the truth was, he had known her for 2 years. He knew her name, knew she had a little daughter, knew her ex-husband had controlled her until she couldn't breathe and then thrown her away. He knew everything, and she knew nothing about him. This is a story about the silent love of a crime lord, about the thin line between protection and possession, and about a single mother who dared to walk through the darkness to reclaim her life. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so others can hear it too. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. The VIP room sat at the end of the second-floor hallway of velour, separated from the main dining area by a thick oak door. Inside, Carrick Dane sat across from a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, sweat beading on his forehead even though the air conditioning was running at full power. The man's name was Ray Kellerman, the owner of a casino in Wynwood, and he owed Carrick a debt that was already 3 months overdue. Kellerman kept talking, his voice trembling, offering one excuse after another. Carrick didn't interrupt. He sat still, his fingers gently turning the glass of water on the table, his eyes fixed on Kellerman as though he were reading every line of thought inside the man's head. When Kellerman stopped to breathe, Carrick folded the napkin on his lap neatly, placed it on the table, and stood up. "The money is in the account before midnight, or tomorrow morning your casino won't be yours anymore." Just one sentence. His voice didn't rise, didn't fall, flat as the surface of ice water. Kellerman swallowed, nodded, and hurried out of the room as if the chair beneath him were on fire. The door had barely closed when Walsh stepped in through the side entrance. Walsh was Carrick's right hand, a man who had followed him for more than 15 years, the kind of man who spoke little and did much. "Will he pay?" Walsh asked. Carrick buttoned his suit jacket. "Before 11 o'clock. Walsh nodded and asked nothing more. Between these two men, most communication lived in silence. Carrick stepped out into the hallway. Velour was crowded on a Friday night, soft jazz drifting up from the main hall, mingling with laughter and the clink of glasses. He paid no attention to any of it. His mind was already calculating the meeting with Dane Capital's board of directors next Monday, the 3 real estate projects that needed to be signed before the end of the month, and the cash flow restructuring plan he had laid out at the beginning of the year. Carrick Dane was always thinking 3 steps ahead. That was how he had kept everything in his hands for the past 10 years. Then she crashed into his chest. It was a hard, sudden impact. Carrick stepped back half a step. In front of him stood a young woman in a velour server's uniform, her hair tied up in a hurry, her eyes wide open, not the startled look of someone who had simply bumped into another person. It was the look of someone running for her life. She looked up, her hand gripping his arm as if she were clinging to a life raft. "Please," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Pretend you know me." Carrick didn't have time to answer. Heavy footsteps sounded behind her, followed by a man's voice, loud enough to be clearly heard in the hallway. "Tessa, don't run." The man stepped closer, a gray suit, neatly combed hair, a thin smile on his lips, but cold eyes. Jared Whitmore. He looked at Tessa, then looked up at Carrick, and that smile faded a little when he noticed her hand gripping the arm of the man in front of her. "Who do you know here?" Jared asked, his voice still holding on to politeness, though his eyes couldn't hide his irritation. Carrick looked down at Tessa's hand on his sleeve. Then he looked up at Jared. He didn't know what was happening between these two people, but he recognized something he had seen too many times in his life. Fear, in the eyes of a woman standing before a man who believed he had the right to control her. And Carrick had one rule, the only rule he had never broken throughout his career. Never touch women. Never let anyone touch women in front of him. He stepped to the side, placing himself between Tessa and Jared. Not hurriedly, not dramatically. He simply moved, and his shadow swallowed her completely. "She's busy. With me," Carrick said, his eyes fixed on Jared. Jared blinked. He wasn't used to being blocked in the middle of his path, especially not by a complete stranger, especially not by a gaze like that. Carrick's eyes weren't angry, weren't threatening. They simply said that this conversation was over. "I'm talking to my ex-wife," Jared said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Ex-wife?" Carrick repeated those 2 words, his voice quiet and flat. "Which means she isn't your wife anymore. Which means you've got no reason to stand here." Silence. The hallway suddenly seemed twice as long. Jared looked at Carrick, then down at Tessa, standing behind him, then back at Carrick again. He wanted to say more, but there was something in the way Carrick stood, in the absolute stillness on his face, that made Jared understand this wasn't a man to make trouble with in a crowded restaurant hallway. Jared swallowed the last thing he wanted to say, turned around, and walked away. His footsteps were quicker than when he had arrived. Carrick stood there for a few more seconds, until Jared had completely disappeared at the end of the hallway, then turned back to look at Tessa. She was still standing behind him, both hands clenched together, her chest rising and falling. But her eyes were no longer panicked. They were slowly returning to normal, though a trace of fear still hadn't had time to fade. "Thank you," Tessa said, her voice slightly hoarse. "I'm sorry, I didn't know what else to do." "No need to apologize." Tessa took a deep breath, smoothed back her hair, and tried to regain the professional calm of a server in the middle of her shift. "I have to get back to work." Carrick nodded. Then he took a business card from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to her. "If that man comes back, call me." Tessa looked at the business card, then looked up at him. She wanted to ask why a complete stranger would help her, why he would give his phone number to a waitress he had only just met for the first time. But Carrick had already turned and walked away before she could open her mouth. No explanation, no introduction, not even a polite smile. Tessa watched his back disappear at the end of the hallway, then looked down at the business card. Carrick Dane, Dane Capital Holdings. No title, no slogan, just a name and a phone number. She slipped the card into the pocket of her apron, drew in a long breath, and pushed the door open to step back into the restaurant hall. As for Carrick, he stopped at the end of the hallway. He turned his head and looked back over his shoulder. Tessa had already disappeared behind the door, but he still looked in that direction for a few more seconds. His eyes weren't curious. They weren't pitying either. They looked like the eyes of a man who had seen this scene many times before, only every time it had been from a distance, and every time he had walked away. Walsh was waiting at the end of the hallway. "Let's go," Carrick said, and stepped into the elevator without looking back again. That night, Tessa worked until the end of her shift, and it was 12:45 at night before she finished clearing the last table. She changed out of her uniform in the staff room, stuffed it into her backpack, then walked to the bus stop 2 blocks from the restaurant. The late-night buses ran far apart, so she had to wait nearly 20 minutes. By the time she reached her studio apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building near Alapata, the clock had already passed 2 o'clock in the morning. There was no elevator in the stairwell, and the light on the 2nd floor had burned out last week and still hadn't been replaced. Tessa climbed the stairs in the dark, her key already in her hand because she knew the way by heart. She opened the door as quietly as she could. The apartment had only one room, with the kitchen and bed separated by a fabric curtain. Bree was asleep on the bed, curled beneath a thin blanket, hugging the stuffed bear whose ears had already worn soft and frayed. The babysitter sat in the chair beside the bed, nodding off, and woke when she heard the door. Tessa nodded in greeting, opened her wallet, and counted out $20 from tonight's tips, almost all of it. She handed over the money and whispered, "Thank you." The babysitter took the cash, put on her coat, and left without saying much because both of them had known this routine for a long time. The door closed. The apartment fell silent again, with only the steady sound of Bree's breathing and the old air conditioner humming on the wall. Tessa set her backpack on the floor, washed her face, changed into her home clothes, then sat down at the small kitchen table. On the table was the old laptop she had bought from a thrift shop for $80, its screen slightly yellowed in the left corner, but still working. She opened it and logged into the online nursing program she had enrolled in at the beginning of the year. This week's lecture was about basic anatomy, and she was already 2 lessons behind schedule. Tessa pressed play, turned the volume down as low as it would go so she wouldn't wake Bree, then began taking notes in the notebook she used for both schoolwork and grocery lists. Her eyes grew heavy after 15 minutes. Her head dipped, then lifted again. She rubbed her eyes, took a sip of cold water, and turned back to the screen. Her body had been awake since 5 o'clock yesterday morning so she could take Bree to school, then wait tables from 4 in the afternoon until nearly 1 o'clock at night. But if she didn't study tonight, there wouldn't be time tomorrow either, because tomorrow she would have to take Bree to school again, wait tables again, and come home late again. The schedule kept repeating itself, and the only empty space she had left for studying was the handful of hours after midnight, when Bree was already asleep. Tessa pulled a few sheets of paper aside to make room for her notebook, and that was when she saw the envelope lying under the pile of mail. Late rent notice. 2nd month. She didn't need to open it, because last month she had received an envelope exactly like it. She knew what was written inside. She knew that if the 3rd month passed without payment, the landlord would send an eviction notice. Tessa looked at that envelope for 3 seconds. Then her eyes shifted to the piece of paper lying right beside it. A crayon drawing, messy in the way only a 4-year-old child's drawing could be. 2 people holding hands, one tall and one small, standing in front of a square with a triangle roof. Beneath it, Bree had written in crooked block letters, misspelled, Mom, and B. Tessa looked at the drawing. Then she looked back at the overdue notice. She picked up the envelope, folded it in half, and tucked it into the kitchen table drawer with the other envelopes that had been folded in half the same way before. Then she turned back to the laptop, rewound the lecture to the place where she had left off, and continued taking notes. No sigh. No more rubbing her eyes. The pencil moved across the paper. The instructor's voice droned softly through the small speaker, and Bree kept sleeping peacefully on the other side of the curtain. The apartment was only 30 square meters, but inside those 30 square meters, Tessa Grant kept everything running with exactly what she had: 2 hands, 1 clear head, and a refusal to fall apart. 3 days after the night at Velour, Tessa came home from work later than usual because she had to stay behind and help clean out the storage room. She opened the mailbox on the ground floor and took out a small stack of mail, the electric bill, advertisements, and a thick white envelope with the name of a law firm she had never heard of printed in the upper left corner. But from the way that firm's name was embossed in gold ink against the white paper, she already knew where it had come from. Jared never used anything cheap, not even when he was using it to pressure someone else. Tessa opened the envelope right there on the stairs. Inside was a petition for custody, 14 pages long, neatly stapled together. She read the first page. Plaintiff, Jared Whitmore. Defendant, Tessa Grant. Reason: the mother had no stable income. The living environment did not ensure the child's development, and she lacked the financial capacity to provide a proper education. Tessa's hands began to shake by the 2nd page. By the 5th page, she had to lean her back against the stairwell wall because her knees had gone weak. She read all 14 pages standing right there, beneath the flickering hallway light, and when she finished, she folded the papers, slipped them back into the envelope, and walked up the stairs to her apartment without making a sound. Bree was asleep. The babysitter had already gone home. Tessa placed the envelope on the kitchen table, right beside the spot where, a few days earlier, she had left the drawing that said Mom and B. She sat down in the chair, put both hands on the table, and stared at that envelope. Jared had 3 lawyers. She didn't have a single one. Jared had a 5-bedroom house in Coral Gables, a 6-figure bank account, and a family ready to testify that he was a wonderful father. She had a 30-square-meter studio, 2 months of unpaid rent, and a night shift waitressing job. If this case went to court, she knew the outcome before the judge ever brought down the gavel. Tessa's eyes stopped on the business card, stuck to the refrigerator door. She had slipped it into her apron pocket that night at Velour, come home meaning to throw it away, but in the end, she had stuck it to the fridge with the little strawberry-shaped magnet Bree liked to play with. Carrick Dane, Dane Capital Holdings, 1 phone number. She didn't know who he was, what he did, or how rich he might be. She only knew that night he had stood between her and Jared without anyone asking him to, and when he left, he hadn't demanded anything from her. Tessa looked at the business card, then back at the lawsuit envelope, then toward the curtain behind her, where Bree was sleeping. She took out her phone and dialed the number on the card. The phone rang 3 times. Carrick Dane. His voice was alert even though it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, as if he hadn't slept, or never slept at all. "It's Tessa, the waitress from Velour a few nights ago. You said if I needed anything, I should call." Silence for 2 seconds. "I remember. I'm not calling because of what happened that night," Tessa said quickly, as though she were afraid he might misunderstand. "I wanted to ask if you know any lawyer, someone good with family law. I need help, but I don't have much money." Another 3 seconds of silence. Then Carrick said, clipped and direct, "Meet me. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'll send the address." The next morning, Tessa dropped Bree off at school, then went to the coffee shop Carrick had texted her about. He was already sitting at the innermost table, with Walsh standing a few yards away. Carrick wore a dark shirt, no suit jacket. but the way he sat still carried the same kind of power Tessa had felt that night in the hallway at Velour. She sat down across from him, placed the lawsuit envelope on the table, and told him everything. No careful lead-in, no hiding. She told him about Jared, about the 3-year marriage where she had been cut off from friends, family, and work, about how she had dropped out of medical school because Jared wanted her to stay home, about the divorce where she had walked away with nothing because his team of lawyers had been stronger than anything she could afford. And now Jared wanted to take the last thing she had left. Carrick listened from beginning to end without interrupting. When Tessa stopped, he didn't say, "I understand," or "I feel sorry for you." He asked, "That man dares to pressure you because you don't have anyone standing beside you. Is that right?" Tessa didn't answer, but her silence was the answer. Carrick tapped his finger lightly on the table twice, a habit he had when he was calculating. "I have a proposal," he said, "in front of Jared, and in front of society. I'll be your boyfriend. That man won't dare touch you if he knows who you're standing beside. In return, I need you to accompany me to a few public events. My company is in the middle of a transition, and I need the image of an ordinary person beside me, not someone from high society." Tessa looked at him. "You're saying I should play your girlfriend?" "I'm saying I'll play your boyfriend. It benefits both sides." Tessa shook her head. "I don't sell myself to be protected." Carrick didn't look offended. He looked straight into her eyes, his voice still as flat and quiet as it had been that night at Velour. "I'm not buying. I'm offering. You have the right to refuse." He stood up, buttoned his shirt cuff, and placed another business card on the table, this time with a lawyer's name written on the back. "Whether you agree or not, call this woman. She's good, and she owes me a favor. You won't have to pay." Then he left, with Walsh following behind him. Tessa sat alone in the coffee shop, staring at the 2 business cards on the table. One was Carrick's, one was the lawyer's. She slipped both into her pocket, stood up, and went to pick Bree up from school. That afternoon she took Bree to the park, pushed her on the swing, and watched her laugh. That night, she worked the night shift as she always did. When she came home late, Bree was already asleep. Tessa sat down at the kitchen table, opened the lawsuit envelope, and read it again. 14 pages. Jared's 3 lawyers. The reasons for the petition were written in clean, polite, legal language, but every sentence said the same thing. She wasn't good enough to be a mother. Tessa set the papers down and looked toward Bree, sleeping behind the curtain. The little girl was clutching the stuffed bear with the worn ears, her mouth slightly open, sleeping so deeply she didn't know the world outside that curtain was trying to pull her out of her mother's arms. Tessa took out her phone, dialed Carrick's number. The phone rang twice. Carrick Dane. "I agree," Tessa said. "When do we start?" The first event was a charity gala at the Fontainebleau Hotel, the kind of event where one admission ticket cost as much as 3 months of Tessa's rent. That afternoon, a black car stopped in front of her apartment building. The driver opened the door, and behind the seat was a garment bag with an outfit already prepared inside. Tessa looked at the outfit, looked at the car, then looked down at the old sneakers on her feet. She drew in a breath, carried Bree over to the babysitter, and got into the car. In the hotel dressing room, Tessa put on the outfit Carrick had prepared. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman she didn't recognize. Not because the outfit was beautiful, but because she wasn't used to seeing herself in anything that wasn't a server's uniform or an old t-shirt at home. She straightened the shoulder of the outfit, stepped outside, and felt as if she were wearing someone else's armor. Carrick was waiting for her in the lobby. He looked at her for 1 second, nodded, then offered his arm. No compliment, no comment. Just a gesture inviting her to walk with him. Tessa placed her hand on his arm, and they entered the Fontainebleau ballroom among hundreds of people, holding wine glasses, shaking hands, talking and laughing with smiles that had been carefully calculated. Walsh walked about 5 steps behind them, his eyes sweeping the room out of habit. Tessa tried to stay calm. She didn't belong in this place. Every time someone looked at her, she wondered whether they knew who she was, whether they knew that 3 days ago she had still been carrying plates for people exactly like them, but she kept her back straight and her step steady, because she had agreed, and she wasn't the kind of person who swallowed her own word. 40 minutes after they arrived, Tessa saw Jared. He was standing on the other side of the ballroom, in a group of 4 or 5 men in suits, holding a glass of wine, laughing and talking with ease. Jared Whitmore was always perfect on the social stage, a broad smile, a warm voice, A firm handshake. No one could look at him and imagine this was the man who had sent a 14-page petition to take a child away from a single mother who was behind on rent. Tessa saw him before he saw her. Her fingers tightened around Carrick's arm. Carrick felt it, but he didn't look down, didn't ask. He only placed his other hand over hers, lightly, for 1 second, then let go. Enough for her to know that he knew. Jared saw them 10 minutes later. He was walking past the silent auction area when his eyes caught Tessa, and beside her was a man Jared didn't know. The smile on Jared's face didn't disappear, but his eyes changed. He set his wine glass down on the nearest table and walked straight toward them. "Tessa," Jared said, his voice warm, as if they were old friends who had run into each other by chance. "I didn't expect to see you here. Who are you with?" He looked at Carrick, his eyes moving from top to bottom, trying to figure out who this man was and why he had never seen this face among Miami's high society. Carrick looked at Jared. He recognized him at once as the man from the hallway at Velour that night. His jaw tightened slightly, and his first instinct was to step forward and stand between Tessa and Jared the way he had before. But before he could lift his foot, he felt Tessa's hand hold firmly onto his arm, not gripping him out of fear, holding him back. Tessa released Carrick's arm, stepped forward, and stood directly in front of Jared. She didn't step back, didn't lean away, didn't search for a place to hide behind anyone's back. "Who I came with isn't your business, Jared." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake. It was even and clear enough that 2 people standing nearby turned their heads to look. Jared blinked, unprepared for that response. He was used to the old Tessa, the Tessa from 3 years of marriage. Tessa with her head lowered, Tessa stepping back, Tessa keeping silent to keep the peace. He gave a small laugh, the kind of laugh that came from someone looking down from above. "You don't have to be like that. I'm only concerned. I'm still Bree's father." "Yes," Tessa said. "You're Bree's father. But you're not my husband. You're not the person who decides where I go, who I meet, or how I live." She paused for 1 beat, then continued, every word clear. "Bree needs stability. Bree needs a normal life. Bree doesn't need a father who only appears when he wants to control her mother." The ballroom around them did not fall completely silent, but the people standing close by had stopped talking. Jared felt the attention turning toward him. He was a man who always controlled his public image, and right now that image was being threatened by a night shift waitress, not even 5 feet 5 inches tall, who was looking straight into his eyes without blinking. Jared wanted to answer, but he looked over Tessa's shoulder and saw Carrick standing behind her, silent, both hands in his trouser pockets, his face unreadable, not threatening, not aggressive, just standing there, but his presence weighed more than any words. Jared looked back at Tessa, then looked around and realized he was standing in the middle of a gala with hundreds of eyes nearby. He wasn't foolish enough to create a scene here. "We'll talk later," Jared said, his voice still holding on to calm, though his jaw was clenched tight. He gave a polite nod, turned, and walked away. This time his steps weren't as quick as they had been that night at Velour. This time he walked slowly, controlled, preserving his image. But Tessa knew, and Carrick knew too. He had backed down not because he wanted to, but because he had been forced to. Tessa stood there for 3 more seconds, watching Jared until he disappeared into the crowd. Then she let out a long breath and turned back. Carrick was still standing in the same place, both hands still in his pockets. He looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, there was something different in his eyes. Not pity, not worry. It was closer to respect, the kind of thing Carrick Dane didn't easily give anyone. He said nothing about what had just happened. He simply offered his arm for her to keep walking with him, and they stepped into the crowd as if nothing had happened. The gala ended close to 11 o'clock at night. In the car on the way back, Tessa sat quietly and looked out the window, exhausted, but her back still straight. Carrick sat beside her, phone in his hand. He didn't look at Tessa. He looked at Walsh in the front seat and said, his voice low and even, as if he were reading a perfectly ordinary shopping list, "Investigate Jared Whitmore. Assets, companies, debts, questionable contracts, everything. I want to know every single thing that man is hiding." Walsh didn't turn around, only nodded. "How long?" "No time limit, but as fast as possible." Tessa didn't hear that exchange. Her eyes had closed, her head resting against the car window, and for the first time in weeks, she drifted off to sleep without having to think about the lawsuit before sinking under. 2 weeks after the gala, Carrick came to pick Tessa up for an evening event in the design district. He arrived 30 minutes early because his previous meeting had ended faster than expected. Walsh parked the car below the lobby, and Carrick called Tessa to tell her he was there. Tessa said she needed 20 more minutes because the babysitter was stuck in traffic and hadn't arrived yet. "Can you wait in the car? I can come up and wait too." Tessa hesitated for half a second, then read him the apartment number. Carrick went up to the 3rd floor and knocked. Tessa opened the door, her hair still wet, a towel wrapped around her shoulders. "I'm sorry, I'm not ready yet. Give me 15 minutes. She opened the door wider for him to come in, then turned back toward the bathroom to keep getting ready. Carrick stepped into the studio apartment and, for the first time, saw Tessa's real living space. Smaller than the VIP room at Velour. 1 bed, 1 kitchen table, 1 curtain splitting the room in 2, and the faint smell of children's fabric softener in the air. The refrigerator was covered with crayon drawings and fruit-shaped magnets. On the kitchen table lay an open notebook filled with notes from an anatomy lecture, beside a child's box of crayons. Then Carrick heard the sound of tiny feet on the floor. He turned around. A 4-year-old girl stood about 2 meters away from him, wearing pajamas printed with cats, holding a stuffed bear with worn ears, her round eyes staring up at the strange man standing in the middle of her home. Bree didn't cry. She didn't run to find her mother. She stood still, tilted her head to one side, and studied Carrick with the pure curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to fear the world. "Who are you?" Bree asked. Carrick looked down at the little girl. He had faced casino bosses, had sat in boardrooms with people who could buy an entire neighborhood with 1 phone call, had spoken to the FBI without changing expression. But the question from a 4-year-old child in cat pajamas made him stand frozen for 2 seconds, not knowing how to answer. "I'm your mom's friend," he said, and immediately realized it was the first time in a very long while he had to weigh every word before speaking. Bree tilted her head to the other side. "Mom's boyfriend?" Carrick Dane, the man Walsh had once said could never be asked anything that would make him flustered, opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked toward the bathroom where Tessa was getting ready, hoping she would come out and save him, but all he heard was the sound of the hairdryer. "Something like that," he said, and felt how ridiculous the answer sounded. Bree didn't care about his awkwardness. She seemed to accept that answer as an obvious truth, and moved on to the next subject immediately. "Do you like watching Bluey?" "I don't know what Bluey is." Bree's mouth fell open, her eyes widening as if she had just heard something unbelievable. "You don't know Bluey?" She took Carrick's hand and pulled him toward the bed, where an old iPad was already open. "Sit down. I'll show you." And Carrick sat down, not because he wanted to watch cartoons, but because the tiny hand of a 4-year-old child tugged at him with a force that was only 1/10 of the weight behind Kellerman's handshake that night, and yet somehow he couldn't resist it. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the foot of the bed, while Bree climbed down beside him, placed the iPad on his lap, and pressed play. The stuffed bear with the worn ears was squeezed between them like a third audience member. Tessa stepped out of the bathroom 7 minutes later, fully dressed, fastening an earring. She stopped in the doorway. In front of her was Carrick Dane, the man she had seen force a casino owner to nod with a single sentence, the man who had stood between her and Jared without changing expression, the man an entire gala ballroom hadn't dared look at for more than 2 seconds. He was sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor, beside her daughter, watching a children's cartoon on an iPad with a cracked corner. Bree was explaining to him that Bluey was a dog, not a cat, in the most serious voice a 4-year-old could possibly have. Carrick nodded, his face still as solemn as if he were listening to a quarterly financial report. Tessa stood in the doorway, looking at that scene, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not love. Not yet, but it was the first time since the divorce that she had looked at a man sitting beside her daughter and hadn't felt afraid. The event that night went normally. Jared didn't appear. They left early because Tessa was worried about Bree. On the way back, Carrick was quieter than usual. When the car stopped in front of Tessa's building, he got out and opened the door for her, then walked upstairs with her. Tessa opened the door and stepped inside. Bree was asleep on the bed, and the babysitter was sitting beside her, reading a book. Tessa paid her, saw her out, then turned back and found Carrick standing at the door, looking at Bree as she slept. His eyes rested on the child in a way Tessa couldn't understand. Not the way a stranger looked at someone else's child. It was deeper than that. Farther than that. as if he were looking at something he had lost a very long time ago, suddenly appearing again in another form. "Are you used to children?" Tessa asked softly, standing beside him. Carrick didn't answer right away. He kept looking at Bree. The silence stretched long enough that Tessa thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then he said, his voice flat, light, almost without emotion. But it was the absence of emotion that made it heavy. "I had a little sister. She died when she was 6. Tessa said nothing. She stood still beside him, her eyes facing forward, not turning to him, not asking more. In the small studio, there was only the steady sound of Bree's breathing and the old air conditioner on the wall. Carrick added, still in that same voice, still flat, still not looking at Tessa, "I was 14. My father's enemies came to the house. Nora was playing outside. He stopped. She didn't make it." He said nothing more. He didn't name his father, didn't explain the empire, didn't say what happened afterward. Just 3 sentences. But those 3 sentences explained everything. They explained why he had stepped out to stand between Tessa and Jared in the hallway at Velour, without anyone asking him to. They explained why he had a rule against ever touching women and children in a business where rules were the rarest luxury. They explained why he was pouring billions of dollars into turning an entire empire from underground to legitimate, even though doing so was slower, less profitable, and many times more dangerous. Because the empire his father had built had taken the one thing money could never buy back, and Carrick had spent his whole life making sure it didn't take anyone else. Tessa reached out and placed her hand on his arm, lightly, without saying anything. Carrick looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then looked up at Tessa. For the first time, she saw that his eyes weren't cold, not warm either, just empty, like a room that had been cleared out a very long time ago, and no one had ever stepped back inside. Then he gave a small nod, like a thank you that didn't need words. He stepped toward the door. "I have a meeting tomorrow night. Walsh will call you about next week's event." His voice had returned to normal. Cold, clipped, controlled, as if the 30 seconds before had never happened. The door closed. Tessa stood alone in the studio, looking at the door, then over at Bree sleeping. She didn't know much about Carrick Dane, but tonight, she knew one more thing. Somewhere, beneath that cold, powerful armor, there was a 14-year-old boy, still standing in the yard, looking down at the place where his little sister had once played. Over the following weeks, the arrangement between Tessa and Carrick began to operate. Once or twice each week, Carrick picked Tessa up for events, business dinners, or partner meetings. In the car on the way there and back, they began to talk. Not the kind of polite conversation between 2 people pretending, but the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people are sitting side by side in a car at 11 o'clock at night, the city sliding past the window, and the silence has become comfortable enough to be filled with true stories. Tessa told him about her years as a medical student. She told him she had been at the top of her class for 2 straight semesters before she dropped out. That her supervising professor had called 3 times to ask whether she was coming back. That she had said no, not because she didn't want to, but because Jared had said if she kept going to school, then who would stay home to take care of the child? And she had believed him, because back then, she thought that was how a family was supposed to work. Carrick listened, didn't interrupt, didn't comment. When Tessa stopped, he asked only one question. "Do you still want to go back?" Tessa looked out the window. "I study until 2 o'clock in the morning every night. What do you think?" Carrick didn't answer, but Tessa saw the corner of his mouth lift slightly, so quickly that she wasn't sure whether she had imagined it. Carrick also began to talk more. Not more in the usual sense. He was still the quietest man in every room. But with Tessa, he began answering in sentences longer than 2 words. He told her about work, about the plan to transform Dane Capital from an organization with too many gray areas into a fully legitimate investment fund. He didn't use words like underground empire or anything grand. He said it simply. "My father built something in a way I don't want to continue. I'm fixing it." Tessa didn't ask for more details. She understood that there were things Carrick would tell her when he was ready, and there were things she didn't need to know. Then, one Tuesday morning, Tessa arrived at Velour to begin her afternoon shift, and the manager called her into the office. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. The manager said the restaurant had received feedback from an important customer that Tessa had psychological issues, was unstable, and could affect the VIP guest experience. The manager didn't name that customer, but he didn't need to. Tessa already knew. There was only one person in the world who would take the time to call a restaurant manager just to destroy her job. The manager handed Tessa her final paycheck envelope, said sorry in a voice that wasn't really sorry, and the conversation ended. Tessa held the paycheck envelope, walked out the back door of the restaurant, and sat down on the concrete steps leading to the parking lot. Miami was 93 degrees Fahrenheit, the smell of garbage rising from the corner of the lot, traffic roaring from the street outside. Tessa sat there, looked down at the paycheck envelope in her hand, and didn't cry. She took out her phone, opened a job search site, and began sending applications. The first place was a diner in Brickell, looking for an evening server. The second was a coffee chain near Bree's school, hiring part-time staff. The third was an Italian restaurant in Coconut Grove. All of them paid less than velour, but Tessa didn't have the right to be selective right now. She sent 3 applications in 10 minutes, then sent 2 more. The fourth was a private clinic in Midtown, hiring a receptionist and nursing assistant, requiring basic medical knowledge. Tessa looked at that job listing, read the requirements carefully, then sent her application along with information about her 2 years of medical school and the online nursing program she was currently taking. The fifth was a bakery near home, looking for a morning cashier. 5 job applications. Sitting on the back steps of the restaurant that had just fired her, beside the garbage cans, under the 34-degree heat. Tessa Grant didn't cry, didn't call anyone, didn't sit there feeling sorry for herself. She stood up, brushed off her pants, walked to the bus stop, and went home to pick up Bree. The first 3 places rejected her within a week. The bakery accepted her, but it only paid minimum wage, not enough to live on. The clinic called back and invited her for an interview. Tessa went, met the clinic manager, and spent more than 30 minutes answering questions about basic medical knowledge, experience communicating with patients, and her ability to handle files. She didn't know that her application had almost sunk beneath hundreds of other resumes if someone hadn't made sure it was reviewed. She didn't know that Carrick, after hearing from Walsh that she had lost her job, had called someone he knew in the medical field and said exactly one sentence. "There's someone who applied to your clinic. Her name is Tessa Grant. Read her file." No asking for special treatment. No pressure. Just making sure the file was opened instead of thrown away. The rest belonged to Tessa, and Tessa passed the interview on her own ability. The following week, in the car on the way to a business dinner, Tessa told Carrick, "I got hired at a private clinic in Midtown," she said, and there was something in her voice Carrick hadn't heard before. Pride. Not loud pride. A small, quiet kind of pride. The kind carried by someone who had grown used to being knocked down and still stood back up by herself. "The pay is better than velour. The hours are more stable, so I can take Bree to school and pick her up. And the job is connected to medicine, so I can work and learn at the same time." Carrick looked at her. "You deserve it," he said. 2 words. But the way he said those 2 words, softly, without polish, without courtesy for courtesy's sake, made Tessa turn her face toward the window to hide something rising in her eyes that she didn't want anyone to see. Everything changed on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after Tessa started working at the clinic. She had just put Bree to bed and was sitting down to study when her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "You think having someone beside you makes you safe? No one can protect you forever. I'll take back what belongs to me." No signature. None needed. Tessa knew it was Jared. She set the phone down on the table, and both her hands began to shake. Not because she was afraid he would hit her, but because she was afraid that one day he might win. Win the lawsuit. Win in court. Take Bree away. And she wouldn't be able to do anything. Tessa clenched her hands, trying to hold herself together, but her body betrayed her. Her shoulders began to tremble. She called Carrick. She didn't know why. Maybe because he was the only person besides Bree whose phone number she had and truly believed would answer at 11 o'clock at night. Carrick arrived in 20 minutes. He knocked softly because he knew Bree was asleep. Tessa opened the door, her eyes dry, but her shoulders still shaking slightly. She handed him the phone so he could read the message. Carrick read it, his face unchanged, but his fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white. He handed the phone back to Tessa, then said, "No one can touch you when I'm here." Tessa looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway of her tiny studio, more than a head taller than she was, and that sentence wasn't an empty movie kind of promise. It was the statement of a man with enough power to carry it out, and she knew that. She also knew she should have kept her distance, that this was an arrangement, that she shouldn't depend on anyone, that after the divorce, she had sworn to herself she would never need a man in order to feel safe. But that night, standing in the doorway, her shoulders still trembling, her daughter sleeping behind the curtain, and the man in front of her looking at her with eyes that promised nothing but the truth, Tessa stepped forward, rested her forehead against his chest, and closed her eyes. Carrick stood still for 1 second. Then his hands rose, slowly, and settled on her back. He didn't pull, didn't hold her tightly. He only placed them there, lightly, as if afraid she would step away if he used any force. Tessa didn't step away. She stood still, her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and slow, completely different from the frantic rhythm of her own. Then she looked up, and Carrick bent down. Their first kiss wasn't the kind of kiss from a movie. There was no music, no falling rain, no one running across a field. It happened in the doorway of a 30-square-meter studio, with the smell of children's fabric softener in the air, the old air conditioner humming on the wall, and a 4-year-old child sleeping deeply behind the curtain. But when Carrick placed his lips on hers, Tessa knew. The fake arrangement had died at some point, and what had replaced it was more real than anything she had ever had. While Tessa's life was slowly beginning to stabilize with her new job at the clinic, the other side of Carrick Dane's world began to crack. One Monday morning, Walsh placed a thin file in front of Carrick in his office at Dane Capital Holdings. The contents were brief. The chain of 4 restaurants Carrick had been using to move cash flow from business operations that had not yet been fully converted had been bought out over the past week. The buyer was a shell company, but Walsh had dug 2 layers deeper and found the name behind it, Franklin Voss. Carrick read that name, set the file down, and said nothing for 15 seconds. Franklin Voss was the kind of man Florida's underground finance world called a vulture. He didn't build empires. He waited for someone else's empire to show a weakness, then tore into it. Voss had tried to do this in Tampa and failed. In Jacksonville, he had been pushed out. Now he had set his sights on Miami, on Carrick, and the first step was swallowing the restaurant chain Carrick had been using. That was not a business transaction. It was a declaration of war. Carrick understood that, and he wasn't the kind of man who sat still waiting for the second blow. That afternoon, Walsh drove Carrick to the largest restaurant in the chain of 4 that had just been bought, located on Biscayne Boulevard. According to the information Walsh had, Voss was inside, meeting with the new management team he had just appointed. Carrick stepped out of the car, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked straight in. The hostess at the door recognized Carrick. Every employee in this restaurant knew who the real owner had been before Voss bought the paperwork. The young hostess stood up, her mouth opening as if she meant to say something, but Carrick had already passed her without looking. He walked straight through the main dining room, turned into the back meeting room, where the frosted glass door was closed. He didn't knock. He opened the door and stepped inside. Inside, Franklin Voss was sitting at the head of the table, with 5 people around him, the new management team. Faces Carrick didn't recognize, except for the 2 at the far end of the table, the restaurant's former managers, men who had worked under Carrick before Voss bought the place. Voss was in the middle of speaking when the door opened. He looked up, saw Carrick standing in the doorway, and the sentence died in his throat. Carrick didn't step into the room. He stood right at the door, his arms resting at his sides, his eyes fixed on Voss. The meeting room went silent at once, the kind of silence that didn't come from politeness, but from instinct, the kind of silence that happens when something dangerous enters the room, and everyone feels it, but no one dares to give it a name. "You're sitting at the wrong table," Carrick said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In the closed room, with 6 people sitting still, that sentence rang clear as a bell. Voss tried to regain his composure. He leaned back in his chair and spread a smile across his face. One he clearly believed looked confident. "Dane, this is a legal transaction. I bought it with money, with contracts, with lawyers. It's just business." Carrick didn't look at Voss. He turned his eyes to the 5 people sitting around the table. One by one, slowly, his gaze paused on each face long enough to make them feel as if they were being read. Then he asked, his voice as ordinary as if he were asking about the weather, "Who do you work for?" Silence. The 5 people looked at one another. The 2 former managers at the end of the table looked down. They knew Carrick. They knew who Carrick was, and they knew sitting at this table with Voss was a decision they would have to pay for. The first to stand was one of the former managers. He said nothing, simply rose, pushed in his chair, and walked toward Carrick. Then he stood behind him. The second was the other former manager, following immediately. Then the third, one of Voss's new people, looked at Carrick, looked back at Voss, and stood up. He didn't know Carrick personally, but he knew the name. In Miami, the name Dane carried more weight than any contract. The fourth followed. The fifth finally stood too, the one who had hesitated the longest. But when he saw he was about to become the only man left sitting beside Voss, he decided loyalty to the new boss wasn't worth the trade. 5 people stood behind Carrick. Voss sat alone at the head of the table, his smile gone. The large meeting room suddenly felt very empty, with only one man still seated. Carrick looked back at Voss. "Next time you want to buy something in Miami," he said, each word clear, slow, in no hurry, "ask me first." Then he turned and walked away. He didn't wait for Voss to answer. The 5 managers followed him out. The meeting room door closed, leaving Franklin Voss sitting alone in the room he had believed, 10 minutes earlier, belonged to him. In the car on the way back, Walsh sat behind the wheel, Carrick in the back seat, his eyes turned toward the window. The silence lasted for 2 full blocks. Then Walsh spoke, his voice more careful than usual. "I have one more thing." Carrick didn't turn his head. "Say it." "Nolan Burke. I found out he's been in contact with Voss's people over the past 2 weeks. Not much, but there was contact. 2 phone calls and 1 meeting at a bar outside Doral. Nolan Burke, one of Carrick's 4 highest-ranking associates, the man in charge of real estate, someone who had followed Carrick since the earliest days, when he took the empire over from his father. If Walsh had said any other name, Carrick would have handled it in 10 minutes. But Nolan wasn't just any name. Carrick fell silent. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Walsh looked through the rearview mirror and waited. He had followed Carrick long enough to know that when Carrick stayed silent this long, it wasn't because he didn't know what to do. It was because he was weighing what he wanted to do against what he should do. "Does Nolan have a family?" Carrick asked. Walsh was slightly surprised by the question. "Yes, a wife and a son. The boy is 12. Another 5 seconds of silence. Walsh held his breath without realizing he was holding it. Then Carrick said, his voice flat, slow, each word placed down gently, like setting a bullet on a table. "Watch him. Don't move yet." Walsh nodded and exhaled. "Understood." The car kept moving along Biscayne Boulevard, Miami sliding past the window, and Carrick Dane sat still in the darkness of the back seat, his face without expression, but his right hand was clenched on his thigh tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. He wasn't angry because Nolan might have betrayed him. He was angry because he had trusted Nolan, and trust, to Carrick Dane, was the most expensive thing he could ever give anyone, and also the one thing he never gave a second time. Jared Whitmore wasn't a man who accepted defeat. After the gala, after Tessa had looked him straight in the eyes in front of hundreds of people, and said the words he had never imagined he would hear from her mouth, Jared began digging. He hired people to investigate Carrick Dane, but what they found was only the surface. Investment fund CEO, substantial assets, a clean record on paper. Not enough. Jared needed something deeper, something that could break the bond between Tessa and the man standing beside her, and that something came from a source Jared had never expected. Nolan Burke contacted Voss after the humiliation at the restaurant on Biscayne Boulevard. Voss needed someone on the inside to understand Carrick. Nolan needed insurance for his own future in case Carrick discovered he was wavering. The 2 men found each other for the same reason. They both wanted Carrick weakened. And when Voss learned that Jared was looking for information on Carrick, he connected the 2 ends. Nolan gave Jared 2 things. First, security camera photos from the Miami courthouse 2 years earlier, showing Carrick standing in the courthouse hallway, looking toward a woman who stood alone outside a courtroom. That woman was Tessa, during her divorce hearing. Carrick wasn't there because of the divorce. He was there for a business meeting in the room next door, but he had stopped. He had looked, and the security camera had captured that moment. Second, a screenshot of messages between Walsh and the manager of the clinic in Midtown, in which Walsh had written exactly 2 sentences. "There's a file under the name Tessa Grant. Make sure it's reviewed," the manager replied. Received. Jared had someone send both of those things to the clinic where Tessa was working, tucked inside a brown envelope with no sender's name. The envelope was placed on the reception desk in the morning, before Tessa arrived. When she sat down at her workstation at 8 o'clock, She saw it lying right between the keyboard and her coffee cup. Tessa opened the envelope. Inside were 3 printed photographs and 1 sheet of paper. The first photograph, a courthouse hallway, shot from above, clearly from a security camera. A man stood about 10 meters from the courtroom, his face turned toward the door. Tessa recognized that hallway. She had stood there 2 years ago, alone, with no lawyer, facing Jared's team of 3 attorneys. She looked closely at the man in the photo. Though the security image wasn't very sharp, she recognized that stance, the way he stood with both hands at his sides, his back straight, his head slightly tilted. Carrick. The second photograph, a close-up of his face, still a little blurred but clear enough to confirm it. The third photograph, a screenshot of messages between Walsh and someone named Dr. Langley, the manager of the clinic where Tessa was sitting. 2 short messages, enough for Tessa to understand. She placed the 3 photographs on the desk, lined them up, and looked at them one by one from left to right. The courthouse 2 years ago. Carrick's face, the messages about her job. The paper inside the envelope had no typed words on it, only 1 handwritten line in black ink, in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Ask your boyfriend. Tessa didn't call. She asked to leave in the middle of her shift, told a coworker she had an urgent matter, then drove straight to the office of Dane Capital Holdings. She had never been there before, but she knew the address from the business card, and by now she remembered every number on it. She walked through the lobby, past reception, and security stopped her. She said, "Call Carrick Dane down, or I'm going up." Security called upstairs, and 2 minutes later, Carrick appeared in the lobby. He saw Tessa's face and knew at once that something had happened. He took her up to a private conference room and closed the door. Tessa placed the envelope on the table, took out the 3 photographs, and laid them in front of Carrick. Explain. 1 word. Her voice didn't shake. She wasn't shouting in anger. It was flat and cold, the kind of cold she had learned after 3 years living with a man who specialized in using calmness to control other people. Carrick looked at the 3 photographs. He didn't need time to understand what was happening. He knew that courthouse photograph existed because he knew security cameras recorded everything. And he knew about Walsh's message because he had been the one who gave the order. He looked up at Tessa, and he didn't deny it. "I was at the courthouse that day for a meeting," he said. "I saw you in the hallway. You were standing alone, with no lawyer, facing Jared's 3. You didn't cry." I remembered. He paused. "After that, I had someone look into you. Not to approach you, because I wanted to know who could stand that straight while everything was collapsing around her." Tessa listened, her face unchanged. "And the clinic job? I asked Walsh to make sure your file was reviewed. I didn't ask anyone to hire you. You passed the interview on your own merit. But that door opened because of you, not because of me." Carrick was silent. He had no argument against that, because it was true. Tessa looked straight into his eyes. "I thought that job was mine. I was proud of it. Every day I went to work, I thought I had stood back up on my own, found my own way. It turns out that was yours too. You're good," Carrick said. "They hired you because you're capable. I only opened the door. I don't need anyone opening doors for me without asking me first." Tessa's voice still didn't rise, but every word landed heavier than the one before it. "Jared opened doors for me without asking. He decided where I went, what I did, how I lived, all without asking. It took me 3 years to get away from that. And now I find out the person I trusted did the same thing. The only difference is that you did it with a gentler hand." Carrick didn't answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew anything he said right now would sound like an excuse. And Carrick Dane didn't make excuses. He watched Tessa stand, slip the 3 photographs back into the envelope, take the envelope, and walk to the door. She didn't slam it. She didn't turn back to say anything else. She simply walked away. Tessa drove to Carrick's apartment, where she and Bree had begun staying a few nights each week over the past month. She opened the door and saw Bree sitting on the living room floor, building with blocks beside the housekeeper. Bree looked up at her mother and smiled. "Mommy, I made a castle." Tessa looked at her daughter, and in those 3 seconds, she gathered everything breaking inside her, pressed it tight, pushed it down, and smiled. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. You did so well." Then she sat down beside Bree and stroked her hair. "Come on, baby. We're going back to our own home." Bree tilted her head. "We aren't staying to play anymore, Mommy? Another day, okay?" Tessa kept smiling, her voice still gentle. her hand still stroking her daughter's hair. Bree didn't ask anything else. The little girl stood up, hugged her stuffed bear with the worn ears, and took her mother's hand as they walked out the door. Mother and daughter stepped into the elevator, and Bree told Tessa about the block castle, her voice bright and bubbling. Tessa nodded, smiled in the right places, asked the right questions. Not for a single second did Bree sense that her mother's world had just collapsed for the second time in her life. When the two of them reached the studio in Alapata, Tessa put Bree on the bed, turned on Bluey for her, then walked into the bathroom. She closed the door, sat down on the floor, and for the first time since meeting Carrick Dane, she allowed herself to tremble. Tessa left on Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday night, Carrick still hadn't called her. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. Carrick Dane was a man who always knew what to say, what to do, which next step to take. But standing before a woman who had looked him straight in the eyes and told him he was no different from the ex-husband she had spent 3 years escaping, he had no answer. He sat alone in the penthouse, in the wide living room, where Bree had been building blocks on the floor just last week, now empty and silent. The stuffed bear with the worn ears that Bree had forgotten was lying on the sofa. Carrick looked at it, then looked away. And right when he was at his weakest, Voss struck. Nolan Burke was the key link. While Carrick was occupied with Tessa, with Gallas, with Jared, Nolan had quietly passed Voss the things only someone inside Dane Capital could have. The files on real estate projects Carrick was moving from unofficial channels into legitimate ones. Lists of transactions still in the middle stage. The kind of transactions that, seen from the outside, without context, would look like unclear money flows. Nolan knew exactly what to take, where to take it from, and which parts to cut away so the picture would look as bad as possible, while still seeming real. Voss received the files from Nolan, added several highly sophisticated forged documents, then sent the entire package to the FBI as an anonymous tip from an internal source. The FBI received a thick file that seemed detailed, seemed consistent, and seemed serious enough to act on. On Friday morning, the FBI came to Dane Capital Holdings. They arrived at 8:15, right when employees were beginning to come into the office. Cars stopped outside the entrance, men in gray suits walked into the lobby, and a search warrant was handed to reception. Everything happened quickly and cleanly. Within 30 minutes, they had sealed 2 offices, seized 3 computers, and taken 4 boxes of documents. Dane Capital's corporate accounts were temporarily frozen by court order. The media reported it by noon that day, a short segment on the local channel, but enough for the name Dane Capital Holdings to appear beside the words "Federal Investigation" on television screens and websites. Carrick was in his office when the FBI arrived. He didn't resist, didn't make trouble, didn't call his lawyer in the middle of it to block the search warrant. He sat at his desk and watched them take the computers and documents away, his face without expression. When an agent asked whether he wanted to say anything, Carrick looked at him and said, "My attorney will contact you." 4 words. Then he turned back toward the glass wall and let them work. But when the FBI left, when the employees of Dane Capital began whispering in the lobby, when the phone started ringing with partners and banks asking what was happening, Carrick realized there was something worse than the FBI. Walsh wasn't answering. Carrick called 3 times, and all 3 went to voicemail. Walsh, the man who had followed him for 15 years, the man who always picked up before the second ring, had disappeared at the exact moment Carrick needed him most. Carrick called a 4th time. Still voicemail. Then he called one of Walsh's men, and the man reported that Walsh was in Fort Lauderdale, that he had left last night after Nolan passed along urgent information, saying there was a problem with a shipment at the port that needed immediate handling. False information. Nolan had drawn Walsh out of Miami at the exact moment the FBI arrived, like pulling the spine out of a body before delivering the blow. By noon, Carrick sat alone in his office. The computers were gone. The accounts were frozen. The phone kept ringing, but none of the calls were the calls he wanted to hear. Associates began to step back. 2 real estate partners called to cancel next week's meeting, giving the reason that they needed to reassess the situation. 3 investors sent emails asking after him in a polite tone that Carrick could read for what it truly meant. They were considering pulling out. A board member texted to ask, "Do you need anything?" in the kind of language everyone understood to mean, "You're sinking, and I don't want to sink with you." Nolan Burke was completely silent. No calls, no messages, no appearance. an absence louder than any words. Carrick stood up and walked to the window. His office was on the 23rd floor, looking down over Biscayne Bay, the Miami skyline stretching into the distance. 10 years ago, he had taken the empire over from his father when he was only 23, the same number as the floor he was standing on now. 10 years of building, repairing, converting, keeping everything in his hands through calculation and absolute control. He had never allowed himself to be in this position, never allowed a situation to slip beyond his reach, never trusted anyone enough that they could hurt him. But in those 10 years, he had also never had Tessa. He had never sat on the floor watching cartoons with a 4-year-old child. He had never kissed anyone in the doorway of a 30-square-meter studio and felt that it meant more than any deal he had ever signed. And those very things, the things Carrick had thought were signs that he was becoming a better man, were the things that had distracted him long enough for Nolan and Voss to strike. Tessa had left because she thought he had controlled her. The FBI had arrived because he had failed to control his own people. Both had happened within 48 hours, and both had struck the same place: trust. Carrick stood at the window, looking down at Miami. The phone on his desk rang again. He didn't pick it up. In the hallway outside, employees moved back and forth, voices lowered, footsteps faster than usual. No one knocked on his office door. No one dared. Carrick Dane stood on the 23rd floor, alone, and for the first time in 10 years, he looked down at the city he had once believed was held in the palm of his hand and realized that his palm was empty. Then the personal phone in his jacket pocket vibrated. Carrick took it out and looked. Not Walsh, not his lawyer, not a partner. A message from a familiar number. From the housekeeper at the penthouse. Bree forgot her stuffed bear on the sofa. Does Miss Tessa want me to send it over? Carrick looked at that message. Looked at it for a long time. Then he slipped the phone into his pocket, turned back to his desk, sat down, and called his attorney. His voice, when he spoke, returned to normal, cold, clipped, controlled, as if nothing had happened. But the stuffed bear with the worn ears was still lying on the sofa in the penthouse, and Carrick Dane knew that out of everything he was losing, it was the only thing he truly wanted to return to the right person. Tessa saw the news on her phone at noon on Saturday, while she was feeding Bree lunch in the studio apartment. A short report on a local news site read, FBI searches Dane Capital Holdings Investment Fund office. Temporarily freezes assets as part of investigation into financial transactions. Attached was a photograph of the office building she had gone to on Wednesday afternoon, the place where she had laid 3 photographs on the table, and asked Carrick, "Explain." Tessa read the report twice, then placed her phone face down on the table. Bree asked, "Mommy, why aren't you eating?" Tessa looked at her daughter and smiled. "Mommy's eating, baby," she said, and scooped up a spoonful of rice. She didn't call Carrick. She was still angry, still felt betrayed, still heard her own sentence echoing in her head. "I don't need anyone opening doors for me without asking me first." But all afternoon, while Bree was taking her nap, Tessa sat at the kitchen table, and one image kept returning to her mind, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. One evening, 3 weeks earlier, she had been sitting on the sofa in Carrick's penthouse, reading a book to Bree, while Carrick sat at the work table on the other side of the room, signing documents. She had happened to glance over and saw the title of one document, a transfer agreement for a piece of land in Overtown to be turned into a non-profit community center. She remembered it because she had asked, "You're building a community center?" Carrick hadn't looked up. He had only said, "That land isn't profitable if left as it is. Changing its use makes more sense." His voice had... Tessa knew she wasn't a financial expert. She didn't know how many transactions Dane Capital had, how many of them were clean and how many weren't, but she knew at least one transaction she had seen with her own eyes was legal, and the report on television was saying all of Carrick's transactions were problematic. That wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true because she had seen it for herself. On Saturday night, after putting Bree to sleep, Tessa sat in her car outside the office of the lawyer Carrick had introduced her to, Margaret Holloway, the woman handling the custody case. The office was closed, but Tessa hadn't come to go inside. She sat in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, staring through the windshield into the darkness of the parking lot. She thought about the divorce hearing 2 years earlier. She had stood alone in the courthouse hallway, with no lawyer, no family, no friends, facing Jared's 3 attorneys. No one had helped her that day. Not one person. She knew what it looked like to stand alone while the whole world turned its back. It wasn't fear. It was transparency. As if she didn't exist, and no one saw her disappearing. Carrick had hidden things from her, had arranged things without asking, had watched from a distance for 2 years. She hadn't forgiven those things, and maybe she wouldn't. But Carrick wasn't the man the television report was trying to make him look like. And Tessa Grant, the woman who had once stood alone in a courthouse hallway, wasn't the kind of person who would sit quietly and watch someone be falsely accused without speaking, no matter how badly that person had hurt her. On Monday morning, Tessa called Holloway. I have information related to the Dane Capital investigation. I'm a direct witness to a legal transaction. I want to give a statement. Holloway was silent for 2 seconds, then said, "Come to my office at 10 o'clock. Tessa went. She gave a detailed statement. The date, the time, the document she had seen, the contents of the land transfer contract in Overtown, the notarized records, the city permits. She signed her name beneath the sworn statement. Holloway passed Tessa's statement to Carrick's attorneys. Tessa's statement, from an independent witness, not a company employee, with no financial interest and no business relationship with Dane Capital, became the missing piece Carrick's legal team had needed. Combined with other records the attorneys had gathered, the rebuttal file was strong enough for the FBI to realize that the anonymous source had provided documents that had been cut apart and distorted. The asset freeze was lifted after 4 days. Carrick saw Tessa as she stepped out of the lawyer's office on Thursday afternoon, the day the assets were released. He was standing in the parking lot, beside Walsh's car, Walsh having returned to Miami 2 days earlier after discovering that Nolan's information had been false. Tessa came through the door, saw Carrick, and stopped. They looked at each other across the wide parking lot, about 10 meters apart. Carrick walked toward her. He didn't say thank you. Didn't say I'm sorry. He only asked one word. Why? Tessa looked straight into his eyes. Because you didn't do it. And I don't let innocent people be falsely accused, no matter what they've hidden from me. Carrick stood still. He wanted to say more. Wanted to tell her she didn't have to do this. Wanted to say he understood if she never wanted to see him again. But before he could open his mouth, Tessa's phone vibrated. She looked down at the screen, and her face changed. The message was from Attorney Holloway. Jared Whitmore has just filed a motion asking the court to review custody again. Reason: relationship with a person with a history of federal investigation. Creating an unsuitable environment for the child. Attached: Dane Capital investigation file plus news article. Tessa, call me immediately. Tessa read the message, then read it again, then slipped the phone into her pocket. She looked up at Carrick. He saw the change in her face and asked, "What happened?" Tessa didn't answer right away. She stood there in the parking lot, with the Thursday afternoon Miami sun burning down, and she looked at the man in front of her, the man she had just helped free from an FBI trap, the man she was still angry with, still hadn't forgiven, but also the man her daughter called Mister, and pulled down to the floor to watch cartoons. Then she thought of Bree, of the 14-page petition, of Jared's 3 lawyers, of the phrase unsuitable environment for the child, and she knew, as clearly as she knew the sun was shining over her head, that if she kept standing beside Carrick Dane, Jared would use that very thing to take Bree from her arms. Tessa called Holloway right there in the parking lot, with Carrick standing a few steps away. The call was short. Holloway spoke plainly, without softening it. If you're still connected to Carrick Dane when the hearing takes place, your chance of losing is very high. They'll use everything related to the FBI investigation to prove you're placing your child in an unsuitable environment. You need to cut off all public contact with him, at least until the custody case is over. Tessa ended the call. She turned back to Carrick. He read everything on her face before she said it. He had lived his whole life reading people, and in that moment, for the first time, he wished he had read wrong. Jared filed a motion asking the court to review custody, Tessa said. Her voice was calm. It didn't shake, didn't break. Calm in the way only people who have grown used to being pushed into corners can be calm. He's using the FBI case, the article, you. The lawyer says if I'm still connected to you when we go to court, I'll lose. Carrick said nothing. He stood still, his face expressionless, but Tessa saw his jaw tighten. I can't see you anymore, Tessa said. Because of Bree, I have to choose, and I choose my child. Silence, the parking lot, the sun, traffic moving on the street outside, the low hum of some car's air conditioner running nearby. I understand, Carrick said. 2 words. His voice didn't break, didn't tremble, flat and cold as always. But Tessa saw his hands fall at his sides, saw his fingers curl slightly and then straighten again, and she knew those 2 words were the heaviest words Carrick Dane had ever spoken in his life. Tessa nodded, turned away, and walked to her car. She opened the door, sat inside, and closed it. She didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew if she looked back, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. She started the engine, drove out of the parking lot, and on the road home to pick up Bree, she kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead, not allowing herself to blink for too long because she knew if she closed her eyes too long, whatever was rising behind them would spill over, and she wasn't allowed to spill over. Not now, not on the way to get her child. Carrick remained standing in the parking lot. Walsh sat in the car, watching through the rearview mirror, but said nothing. Carrick stood there for 10 more seconds, 20 seconds, watching Tessa's car disappear at the end of the road. Then he opened the car door, got into the back seat, and said, "Back to the office." Walsh drove away. No one said another word for the entire ride. Carrick returned to the office after Tessa drove out of the parking lot. He sat down at his desk, didn't turn on the lights, didn't open the computer. Walsh stood at the door, waiting for orders. 10 minutes passed. 20 minutes. Walsh didn't ask, didn't push. He knew that when Carrick stayed silent for that long, it meant he was assembling everything in his head into a plan, and when he finally opened his mouth, that plan would already be complete. "The Jared Whitmore file," Carrick said, without looking up. "The one I told you to prepare after the gala." Walsh nodded. "Finished 3 weeks ago. Complete. Copy it onto a USB. I need it before 9 o'clock tonight." Walsh turned to leave. Then Carrick added, "And prepare Nolan's file. Everything. Contact with Voss, personal transactions, everything you have." Walsh stopped for 1 second, then nodded again. "Tonight?" "Tonight." At 9:15 that night, Carrick walked into the Whitmore Properties office building in Coral Gables. A 4-story building, glass front, the company name in polished brass in the lobby. At this hour, most of the employees had gone home, but Jared Whitmore was the kind of man who often worked late, not because he was hard-working, but because he liked sitting in his own office, looking out over the city, drinking, and feeling important. Carrick knew this from the file Walsh had collected, which included Jared's daily habits. The last receptionist, still in the lobby, looked up when Carrick walked in. She hadn't had time to say anything before Carrick passed her. Walsh following behind, both of them walking straight toward the elevator. The employee stood and called after them. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" Walsh turned back, looked at her, and gave a slight shake of his head. She sat down. The 4th floor. Carpeted hallway, Jared's office door left half open, the glow of a desk lamp spilling out. Carrick pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jared sat behind his desk, his suit jacket hanging over the back of his chair, a glass of liquor in his hand, reading something on his laptop. He looked up, saw Carrick, and the glass stopped halfway to his mouth. "Dane." Jared set the glass down, trying to keep calm. "You don't have an appointment." Carrick didn't answer that. He walked to the desk, pulled out the chair across from Jared, and sat down. Walsh stood outside the door, arms folded across his chest, his back against the hallway wall. Carrick placed a small black USB on Jared's desk. "What's in this?" Jared asked, looking at the USB, then up at Carrick. 5 years, Carrick said. "Every questionable financial transaction of Whitmore Properties. Funds moving through 3 subsidiaries with no actual operations. False tax filings on 4 real estate projects in Miami-Dade. Unclear relationships with 2 building department officials to speed up permits. All of it with dates, numbers, emails, and call records." Jared looked at the USB. The polite smile he always maintained in front of people was gone completely. His face looked paler than usual beneath the desk lamp. "Where did you get this?" Jared asked, his voice still trying to hold on to control, though it couldn't hide the tremor at the end. "You don't need to know where. You only need to know it's real." Carrick leaned back in the chair, both hands resting on the armrests, looking at Jared with the gaze he gave people after he had already made his decision and was simply waiting for them to understand. 2 choices. 1. You withdraw the petition, leave Tessa's life alone, no harassment, no threats, no contact outside the visitation schedule ordered by the court. You're still Bree's father, and you still keep your legal visitation rights. 2. This USB lands on a federal prosecutor's desk tomorrow morning, and you lose the company, your reputation, your freedom, and your visitation rights too, because no one lets a man sitting in prison visit his child every week. Silence. Jared looked at the USB, looked at Carrick, then looked back at the USB. He lifted a hand and rubbed his forehead, a gesture Tessa must have seen hundreds of times during 3 years of marriage. The gesture Jared made when he was calculating and realizing he had no pieces left to play. "You're threatening me," Jared said, but his voice no longer had enough strength to turn it into resistance. It sounded more like a statement than a challenge. "I'm giving you a choice," Carrick said, each word laid down slow and even. "The thing you never gave Tessa." That sentence hit its mark. Carrick saw Jared blink, saw his jaw tighten, then saw his eyes drop. Not because he was ashamed. Jared Whitmore didn't know shame. He looked down because he was calculating the damage, weighing his ego against the price he would have to pay, and realizing that the cost of choosing wrong was higher than anything he was willing to trade. "If I withdraw the petition," Jared said in a low voice, "will you delete this?" "No." Carrick stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "I'm keeping it. So you remember that if you come back to harass her, I won't need to meet you a third time." Carrick turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Jared sat there alone in his own office, staring at the black USB on the desk as if it were an unexploded bomb. Walsh followed Carrick into the elevator. The doors closed. Walsh asked, "Will he withdraw?" Carrick pressed the ground floor button. "Before the end of the week." At 11 o'clock that night, Carrick met Nolan Burke at a bar in Doral, the same place where, according to Walsh, Nolan had first met Voss's man. Nolan was already sitting at a table in the corner, holding a beer he had half finished. He didn't look surprised to see Carrick. He had known this day would come from the moment the FBI left Dane Capital, and Carrick wasn't indicted. Nolan watched Carrick sit down across from him, and there was no fear on his face, only the exhaustion of a man who knew he had gambled and lost. Carrick didn't greet him. He placed an envelope on the table, just as he had placed the USB on Jared's desk an hour earlier. "Inside this are records of contact between you and Voss. 2 calls, 1 meeting, and the material you passed to him, along with files on your personal financial transactions over the past 3 years." Nolan looked at the envelope, but didn't pick it up. "What do you want?" 24 hours. You leave Miami. You don't come back. You don't contact Voss, anyone in the organization, or any partner of Dane Capital. If you're still here after 24 hours, this envelope goes to the Internal Revenue Service, and they'll be very interested to know why an associate of an investment fund has personal cash flow moving through 4 undeclared Cayman accounts. Nolan looked at Carrick. The 2 men had sat at the same table for 10 years, had built the empire together from the ruins Carrick's father left behind. Nolan had known Carrick when he was 23, when he was still young, still hot-blooded, still trying to keep his voice from shaking when giving orders to men 20 years older than him. Nolan knew all of it, and Carrick knew that Nolan knew. "You're not going to punish me?" Nolan asked, his voice light, almost a whisper. Carrick stood and looked down at the man who had once been his closest associate. "That time is over." He turned and walked out of the bar. Walsh waited at the car. Carrick sat in the back seat and closed his eyes. The Miami night was humid and hot, the music from the bars along the streets of Doral drifting faintly into the car. In one night, Carrick had placed 2 envelopes in front of 2 men, each one carrying enough weight to destroy their lives, and both times he had stood up and walked away before they could react. He didn't hit anyone, didn't threaten with violence. He didn't need to. Carrick Dane used information like a blade, and tonight he cut clean through the 2 ropes, tightening around the throat of the woman he loved. Even though that woman had told him she couldn't see him anymore, he didn't do this to win Tessa back. He did it because when Tessa said, "I choose my child," Carrick saw in her eyes the same sacrifice he wished someone had made for Nora nearly 20 years ago. And if he couldn't save Nora, then at least he would make sure no one took Bree from her mother's arms. Walsh looked through the rearview mirror. "Home?" Carrick opened his eyes. "Back to the office. I still have work to do." Jared withdrew the petition on Saturday morning, 2 days after the night Carrick placed the USB on his desk. Jared's attorney sent the official notice to the court and to Holloway. Reason for withdrawal, settled outside of court. Holloway called Tessa with the news. Tessa listened, said thank you, and hung up. She didn't ask why Jared had suddenly changed his mind. She didn't need to ask. She knew there was only one person in this world who could make Jared Whitmore step back without ever going to court. On Sunday afternoon, Carrick came to the studio apartment in Alapata. He came alone, without Walsh, without a private car. He drove himself, parked on the street, walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, and the light on the 2nd floor still hadn't been replaced. He knocked on the door. Tessa opened it. She was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, her hair tied in a ponytail, barefoot. Bree was at the weekend babysitter's because Tessa had worked the morning shift at the clinic. The apartment held only her. She saw Carrick and stood still in the doorway. She didn't invite him in, didn't send him away. She only stood there, looking at him, waiting. Carrick didn't say he was sorry, didn't say, "Let me explain," didn't say, "I miss you." He stood at the door, took a thick envelope from his coat pocket, and handed it to Tessa. She looked at the envelope, then looked at him. He said nothing. She took it. Tessa opened the envelope right there in the doorway. Inside were 3 things. First, the ownership transfer papers for a 2-bedroom apartment in Edgewater, in Tessa Grant's name, notarized, signed, and fully processed. Second, a full scholarship agreement for a 2-year accelerated nursing program at a community college in Miami, already paid in full. Third, a folded sheet of paper, handwritten in straight, neat letters, without a single spelling mistake. Tessa read it. "This is what I can do. Stay or leave. These are yours. No conditions." 14 words. Tessa read those 14 words twice, then looked up. Carrick stood at her door, his arms resting at his sides, his face as expressionless as always, as if he were standing before a business partner instead of the woman he loved. But Tessa had learned how to read Carrick. She had learned how to see through that cold outer shell during the weeks they had spent together, and she saw it. His lips pressed a little too tightly, his jaw slightly rigid, and his eyes looking at her the way they only did when he was trying to keep something from breaking apart. Then Carrick gave a small nod, the kind of nod he gave when ending a meeting, turned around, and walked away. Tessa stood in the doorway, holding the envelope, watching his back move down the hallway toward the stairs. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Each footfall echoed on the old concrete floor. He didn't look back. Carrick Dane never looked back. He gave what he had come to give, then left, as always. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't wait for a response, didn't wait for anything at all. He had done everything he could do, and he was walking away because he believed Tessa deserved freedom, even the freedom not to choose him. Tessa looked down at the envelope in her hand. Apartment transfer papers, nursing scholarship, 14 handwritten words. She remembered Jared. Jared had given her everything too. The big house, the beautiful car, the expensive clothes, the life her friends had envied. But every gift Jared had given came with a string tied around her wrist, and every time she tried to walk away, that string tightened. Jared gave in order to own. Everything he gave was another way of saying, "You belong to me." Carrick gave and walked away. No strings, no conditions, no turning back to wait for her to say thank you. He gave her a home he would never step into unless invited. He gave her a professional future he didn't demand to be part of. He gave her the right to leave without losing anything. Jared gave to keep. Carrick gave to let go. The 4th step, the 5th step. Carrick was almost at the top of the stairs. "Come back here." Tessa's voice wasn't loud. She didn't shout, didn't plead. It rang through the quiet hallway, clear, steady, firm, and Carrick stopped. He stood at the top of the stairs with his back to her. He didn't turn around. His shoulders lifted slightly, as if he were drawing in a breath, then lowered again. But he didn't turn around. Tessa stepped into the hallway, the envelope still in her hand. She walked toward him, barefoot on the cold concrete floor, and stopped 2 steps behind him. "I don't need you to give me freedom," Tessa said. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes weren't wet. She had cried enough already. In the bathroom, behind the curtain, on nights when Bree was sleeping deeply. She wouldn't cry now. "I was already free. I was free from the day I signed the divorce papers, from the day I carried my daughter out of that house, from the day I sat on the back steps of the restaurant and sent out 5 job applications, instead of sitting there crying." She paused for 1 beat. "I don't need you to give me freedom. I need you to stay." Carrick stood still. His back was still turned to her. The silence stretched for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Then he turned around. Slowly. Each part of his spine seemed to shift one by one until he was facing her completely. Tessa looked at his face, and she saw something she had never seen in all the time she had known Carrick Dane. Not tears. Men like him didn't cry. But his eyes were red. The rims, the whites, all of it covered by a thin red layer he couldn't hide, even though his face still held its familiar stillness. It was the face of a man who had kept everything in his hands for 20 years, had controlled every situation, every person, every emotion, and now, for the first time, stood before a barefoot woman in a dark hallway, with no control over anything at all. He didn't hug her, didn't kiss her, didn't step forward. He only stood there, 2 steps away from her, his eyes red, his mouth pressed tight, and looked at her. Tessa didn't step forward either. She stood there, the envelope in her hand, barefoot on the concrete, and looked back at him. The two of them stood in the 3rd-floor hallway of an old building in Alapata, the light on the 2nd floor still broken, the sound of traffic drifting faintly up from the street, and neither of them touched the other. They didn't need to. There are moments when the distance of 2 steps says more than any embrace ever could, and in this moment, in the dark hallway, in the silence, between 2 people who had lost each other and found each other again, that 2-step distance held everything they did not say out loud, that he would never hide from her again, that she would never need to run again, and that this time, they were both choosing to stay. Not because they were afraid of losing each other, but because they wanted to. 8 months later, Miami-Dade County Family Court, 3rd floor, courtroom number 12. Tessa Grant sat at the table on the left, beside Margaret Holloway. In front of her on the table was a neat file, proof of steady income from the Midtown clinic where she had worked for more than half a year, confirmation that she was enrolled in the accelerated nursing program and doing well, the lease for the 2-bedroom apartment in Edgewater under her name, and Bree's preschool report showing that the little girl was healthy, happy, and developing well. At the table on the right, Jared Whitmore sat beside his lawyer, but not 3 lawyers like before, only 1, and that person sat with the posture of someone who already knew the outcome before the hearing even began. Jared had withdrawn his request to review custody many months earlier. Today's hearing was the official and final custody hearing, the one Tessa had been waiting for since the day she received that 14-page envelope on the stairwell of her old apartment building in Alapata. The hearing lasted less than 1 hour. Holloway presented the file. Jared's lawyer did not object. The judge reviewed it, asked a few questions, and issued the ruling. Full custody of Bree belonged to Tessa Grant. Tessa heard the ruling, nodded, and said thank you to the judge and to Holloway. She didn't cry. She didn't hug her lawyer. She stood, shook Holloway's hand, gathered her papers, and walked out of the courtroom. Her steps were steady, her back straight, exactly the way she had walked out of the courtroom 2 years earlier, after the divorce hearing. Only one thing was different. Last time, she had walked out alone into an empty hallway. This time, she walked out and saw Carrick. He was sitting on the row of plastic chairs in the hallway, about 10 meters from the courtroom door. Not standing. Sitting, both hands resting on his thighs, his back against the chair, his face turned toward the courtroom door. He had not gone inside the courtroom. He had not sat behind the spectators. He had not appeared before the judge or Jared. He sat outside, in the courthouse hallway, in the exact place where 2 years ago he had stood and watched a strange woman walk out of her divorce hearing alone. That time, he had watched from a distance and walked away. This time, he sat and waited. Tessa stopped at the courtroom door and looked at Carrick. He looked back at her. He didn't ask the result. He didn't hurry to stand. He simply looked at her, and on his face was something Tessa had learned how to read over the past months. Not a smile, because Carrick rarely smiled, but a very slight loosening around his eyes, at the corner of his mouth, in his shoulders, something only a person very close to him would notice. Something that meant he was at peace. Then tiny footsteps ran across the courthouse tile floor. "Mister, Mommy won!" Bree ran from the children's room at the end of the hallway, her hair tied into 2 little pigtails, her small backpack bouncing on her back, her face glowing. She didn't understand what a hearing was, didn't know what custody meant, didn't know why her mother had to come to court. She only knew Mommy had said that morning she was going to do something important, and when it was done, Mommy would pick her up, and now Mommy was standing at the end of the hallway, and Carrick was sitting in the chair, and everyone she loved was here. So Mommy had won. Carrick stood when Bree rushed toward him. He bent down, lifted her up, one hand supporting her back and one hand beneath her legs, settling Bree on his arm the way he had done dozens of times over the past 8 months. Bree wrapped her arms around his neck, laughing, and asked, "Mister, Mommy won, right?" Carrick looked at Tessa walking toward them, her steps still steady, her eyes still dry, but the corner of her mouth curving in the way. She only smiled when she looked at Bree. "I know," Carrick said. Tessa came to stand before them. She looked at Bree in Carrick's arms, looked at her daughter laughing, looked at the man holding her child, his eyes still carrying that familiar stillness, but his hands holding Bree firmly and carefully, as if he were holding the most precious thing his life had ever touched. The three of them left the courthouse. Tessa walked beside Carrick, not behind him, not holding his hand. She walked on her own feet, steady and even, in the shoes she had bought with her own salary, wearing the outfit she had chosen herself, carrying the victory file she had prepared with her lawyer. Bree sat on Carrick's shoulders, both hands holding his forehead, her legs swinging, her mouth singing some song from Bluey that she knew by heart. Carrick walked with one hand holding Bree's leg on his shoulder, eyes facing straight ahead, and beside him was Tessa, the woman he had watched from a distance for 2 years, had kept his distance from, had hidden things from, had been wrong with, had almost lost, and in the end had not lost. Not because he had managed to keep her, but because she had chosen to stay. No one owned anyone. There was no string tying the three of them together as they walked out of the courthouse that afternoon. There was only choice. Tessa chose Carrick not because he was strong, because he was rich, or because he protected her. She chose him because he was the only person who gave her everything, and then walked away, leaving her free to decide. And when she said, "Come back here," he came back. Not because he had won, but because she allowed him to. And Carrick chose Tessa not because she needed him, but because she didn't need him, and still chose him. Life sometimes pushes us into crossroads where no choice is easy, but the story of Tessa and Carrick reminds us that real love isn't possession or control. It is respecting the freedom of the person you love, even their freedom to leave. And a single mother isn't weak when she accepts help. She is at her strongest when she chooses the right person to trust. You don't need someone to save you. You only need someone good enough to stand beside you and let you rise on your own. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so more people can hear it too. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories. How did Tessa and Carrick's story make you feel? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We always read every comment and truly want to hear what you felt from deep inside your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, joy in daily life, and peace in your soul. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.